the Baltic Exchange Illusion. It began with a confidence so complete that few ever questioned it. For decades, the Baltic trading networks operated with an efficiency that bordered on myth. Ships moved on schedule. Contracts cleared without friction. Prices responded to forces so predictable that merchants felt they could navigate the market by instinct alone. But beneath that air of certainty lay a fragile truth: the system worked only as long as everyone believed it would. To understand how an entire regional market unraveled with startling speed, we must return to a moment when the Baltic Sea stood at the crossroads of European commerce. Nations relied on its ports to move grain, timber, metals, and the raw materials that fed growing empires. Traders from Stockholm, Riga, Danzig, and beyond understood that the exchange wasn't merely a marketplace, it was the engine that kept their economies alive. And because the engine ran smoothly, no one imagined it might fail. The story begins with a network of brokers whose reputations were as valuable as their contracts. They bought and sold with a precision that impressed even the most seasoned financiers. Their ledgers were orderly. Their forecasts reliable. Their connections extensive. For years, the system produced wealth so consistently that investors across Europe poured money into the Baltic markets, convinced they had found a sanctuary from volatility. But no market is immune to pressure. Quietly, beneath the surface, small distortions crept into the exchange. A delayed shipment here, an unsettled contract there. Nothing alarming, just enough to hint that the flawless rhythm might be shifting. Brokers noticed, of course, but they dismissed the discrepancies as part of the natural ebb and flow of trade. After all, the exchange had weathered storms before. Why should this time be any different? Yet this time was different. Global demand began shifting in ways the models had not fully anticipated. A geopolitical conflict disrupted supply routes. A series of poor harvests strained grain reserves. Prices wobbled. Forecasts darkened. And slowly, the illusion of stability that had defined the Baltic markets for generations began to thin. Still, the public saw nothing. Ships continued to glide through harbors. Markets opened on time. Prices remained within familiar ranges. But underneath that veneer, the earliest signs of imbalance had already begun to converge. And those closest to the ledgers sensed a quiet tremor, one that carried the unmistakable shape of a crisis waiting to break. The tremors grew more pronounced as the Baltic brokers confronted numbers that no longer aligned with the patterns they had trusted for years. Grain shipments that once arrived like clockwork now appeared days, sometimes weeks, behind schedule. Timber exports faltered as labor disputes flared in northern ports. And metals, normally a stabilizing force in turbulent times, began trading at prices so erratic that even veteran merchants hesitated to commit. The exchange, long celebrated for its reliability, had begun to stutter. Inside brokerage houses, anxiety simmered beneath outward calm. Clerks reviewed contracts with a meticulousness born not of routine, but of fear. They checked signatures twice, confirmed deliveries 3 times, and still found discrepancies they could not explain away. A handful of brokers, those old enough to remember minor panics from decades past, sensed the early stages of something larger. They urged caution, but caution was expensive, and many traders were unwilling to sacrifice short-term profit for long-term stability. Meanwhile, new forces added pressure. Investors from abroad, fueled by years of smooth returns, had begun demanding faster settlements and higher yields. Their presence had inflated the market's confidence, but it also meant the exchange was now tethered to expectations it could never fully control. When shipments slowed and prices wavered, these investors grew restless. Some quietly reduced their exposure. Others issued veiled warnings to their partners. Their exit was not dramatic, but it left gaps, small absences that weakened the structure more than anyone realized. The political climate added to the strain. Tensions between Baltic states and their neighbors disrupted long-standing trade agreements. Tariffs were updated abruptly, sometimes overnight. Port authorities imposed new inspections that delayed cargoes and frustrated shippers. What had once been a region defined by mutual dependence now felt caught in a tug-of-war between competing national interests. Each policy shift sent ripples through the exchange, and each ripple made the market more fragile. Brokers tried to maintain order. They recalculated shipment estimates, renegotiated terms, and reassured clients that the turbulence would pass. But beneath their optimism, a quiet dread grew. The exchange relied on trust that prices reflected reality, that contracts would be honored, that goods would arrive. Yet with every missed shipment and every unstable quote, that trust eroded. And once trust begins to slip, it rarely stops on its own. Merchants began to notice unsettling patterns. Buyers insisted on discounts to compensate for uncertainty. Sellers demanded upfront payments they never needed before. Insurance premiums rose sharply as underwriters recognized the growing unpredictability. Even the docks felt different. Captains arrived with stories of storms, shortages, and confrontations in foreign waters that hinted at deeper instability. Still, the public saw little evidence of crisis. The exchange continued to operate. Markets remained open. Prices, though jittery, stayed within familiar bounds. But those bounds were tightening, and the tension beneath them grew harder to contain. Within broker circles, one question surfaced again and again: was the exchange merely experiencing a rough season, or was it standing at the edge of a broader collapse? No one could say for certain. But the signs, scattered, subtle, undeniable, suggested that the illusion of invincibility was fading. And if the next shock arrived, even a small one, the entire market might find itself facing a reckoning no one was prepared to navigate. The shock arrived on an otherwise ordinary morning, concealed within a routine message from a northern port. A major grain convoy, one that dozens of contracts depended upon, had been delayed indefinitely. Weather was the official explanation, but the figures attached told a harsher story. Reserves were lower than reported, inspections had uncovered inconsistencies, and some shipments had never left their origin despite being sold multiple times through the exchange. It was the kind of revelation that did not merely disrupt trade. It shattered assumption. Inside the Baltic Exchange, panic did not erupt immediately. It seeped in, creeping along the edges of every conversation. Brokers stared at the report in stunned silence before scrambling to assess the damage. The missing grain represented not just a logistical failure but a breach of the trust underlying countless agreements. Contracts linked to the shipment lost value instantly. Counterparties demanded explanations. Phones rang without pause, each call tightening the noose around the exchange's fragile stability. As officials dug deeper, more discrepancies surfaced. A timber consortium reported losses far greater than previously disclosed. A metals exporter declared temporary insolvency. Shipping insurers, sensing danger, raised premiums again, this time to historic highs. What had looked like isolated incidents now formed a pattern, an accumulation of failures hidden beneath years of perceived stability. The illusion was breaking. By midday, whispers of crisis reached merchant circles across the region. Some traders rushed to unwind positions, accepting heavy losses to escape greater ones. Others doubled down, hoping to profit from volatility. But the brokers who understood the system best recognized the danger. The exchange had reached a point where confidence, once fractured, might not return. Inside private conference rooms, the exchange's leadership confronted a grim reality. Their models no longer functioned. Their forecasts no longer held. Their assurances no longer convinced even themselves. The interconnected nature of Baltic trade meant that every failure bled into another, creating a chain reaction that no single authority could isolate. The question was no longer whether trouble was coming, trouble was already here. The challenge now was to prevent collapse. But preventing collapse required clarity, and clarity revealed how deeply the illusion had been woven into everyday operations. Audits uncovered shipments pledged as collateral multiple times. Contracts had been written on assumptions of supply that no longer existed. Some brokers, desperate to maintain appearances, had concealed delays, creating a false sense of security that now unraveled painfully. Even ports once praised for efficiency displayed signs of strain: overcrowded docks, missing records, disputes between shippers and authorities. As evening fell, the mood across the region shifted from unease to fear. Foreign investors, alerted by subtle price movements, began withdrawing from Baltic markets. Their exit accelerated the losses already spreading through the exchange. Banks, reacting to the volatility, tightened credit for merchants. The liquidity that once flowed freely began drying up, leaving traders trapped with obligations they could no longer meet. Crowds gathered outside brokerage houses, seeking information. Brokers, pale and exhausted, offered reassurances they barely believed. Newspapers hinted at structural weaknesses, a phrase that only deepened public anxiety. The exchange, once a symbol of precision and dependability, now stood exposed as a system stretched past its limits. And yet, the worst had not yet arrived. In the shadows of these unfolding events lay a fracture far more devastating than missing shipments or failing partners. A revelation that would force Baltic leaders to confront truths they had long ignored, truths that would determine whether the exchange could survive or whether the regional market would fall into a spiral no intervention could reverse. The worst revelation came in the form of a document no one wanted to read. A senior auditor, pale from lack of sleep, placed it before the exchange's leadership just before dawn. It detailed a discovery that transformed a crisis into a full-blown reckoning. Several of the Baltic region's most trusted brokers had quietly masked losses for years, rolling them forward through creative accounting and speculative positions that only deepened the imbalance. The illusion had not merely cracked, it had been manufactured. The report spread through the highest circles of trade and government with explosive speed. Leaders who had once praised the exchange now demanded explanations. The brokers implicated in the scheme vanished into sudden leaves of absence, their offices shuttered before officials arrived. What began as a market disturbance had evolved into a scandal that threatened to collapse the entire trading architecture that Northern Europe relied upon. As news leaked into the public sphere, panic surged. Merchants flooded brokerage houses, demanding to unwind their contracts or confirm that their shipments even existed. Some discovered that the goods they believed were secured in distant ports had never been loaded. Insurance firms refused new policies. Banks froze credit lines. And the exchange, the heartbeat of Baltic commerce, found itself dangerously close to seizing up entirely. Governments from across the region convened emergency councils. They debated whether to intervene directly, to let the exchange collapse and rebuild from the ashes, or to stabilize it through coordinated guarantees. But each option carried enormous risk. Intervening meant tying national treasuries to a system whose integrity had been compromised. Allowing collapse threatened shortages, unemployment, and political instability. The interdependence that had once been the exchange's strength now trapped governments in a dilemma with no painless resolution. Meanwhile, the markets reacted with brutal swiftness. Prices plunged. Volatility spiked. Foreign investors fled. The Baltic currencies wobbled under pressure. The region had prided itself on being a bridge between East and West, a resilient hub immune to the chaos beyond its shores. But now that hub wavered, exposing how deeply it relied on confidence that could vanish overnight. In the midst of this turmoil, a coalition of northern governments finally agreed on a course of action. They would backstop the most critical contracts, take temporary control of the exchange's central clearing functions, and launch a sweeping forensic investigation. The rescue was not elegant. It was not perfect. But it prevented immediate collapse. Ships continued to sail, albeit under tighter controls. Brokers were monitored. Audits expanded. The bleeding slowed. When the official announcement reached the public, it carried both relief and resignation. Relief that the system would not fall apart entirely. Resignation that the Baltic Exchange, long admired as a paragon of dependability, had proven far more vulnerable than anyone believed. Reforms followed swiftly: stricter reporting standards, mandatory independent audits, and oversight committees empowered to scrutinize even the most established brokers. And yet, the scars endured. Trust, once fractured, cannot be mended simply by decree. Merchants became more cautious. Investors demanded greater transparency. Governments kept a tighter grip on financial networks they once allowed to run on reputation alone. The illusion that had defined the Baltic markets for generations dissolved that year. In its place emerged a sobering truth: even the most stable systems depend on honesty, discipline, and the courage to confront weaknesses before they turn into crises. Without these, no exchange, no matter how storied, can withstand the weight of its own aspirations. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.